and welcome everyone. um, Laura, why don't you kick us off, and then we can
Sure,
take it from there.
happy to. I promise everyone I'm going to be very brief. And we've got this set up as a Zoom meeting really on purpose because these are meant to be as engaging as possible. So we invite you to show your faces and take part. It's not meant to be static by any means. It's meant to be really conversational. I'm the Associate Dean of Development and Alumni Relations at the law school, and we are kicking off this event series called WCL-Now because we want to engage you and give you all opportunities to engage with the law school, the research that we're doing, and we're anchoring it around important events of today. So our first event series really focused on the pandemic, looking at legal ramifications. And what we're doing today is taking a different issue that has been very important and pressing and dealing, oh, might have to mute yourselves, folks, but is really focusing on sport and the impact in the world that we are seeing after events, starting with taking a knee, the backlash to that, and where we've come today, and how corporate America is reacting to that, what is working, what isn't working. So we're just really thankful to have you all here. And again, this is meant to be conversational. Mike is going to lead this through the moderation. You've got some experts in their fields. You're going to learn a lot. We did in our dry run, that's for sure. And I'll stop talking. Mike, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much. And just one piece of housekeeping. So it is a Zoom meeting. We decided to do that. That comes with the risk that people might accidentally unmute themselves. So please just keep an eye on that. Donna, thank you for showing us your face. If you're welcome, if you're willing to turn your video on, it really helps the speakers to see their audience. It's hard. Hey, Tori, how are you? So if it's not too much pressure on you, it actually makes for a more interactive experience on the speaker side. And our goal is to have a moderated conversation for about the first 45 minutes or so, and then move into a more interactive part of the conversation where we're going to invite you to share your experiences and thoughts and sort of dialogue with our guests. Let me just tell you about these fantastic people who are going to lead this conversation. I'm going to start with Kimberly Davis, who is Senior Executive Vice President at the National Hockey League, a trailblazer, change agent, positively disrupting the financial industry and a wide world of sports over 30 years. She's in this role. It's a league-wide role. She's clearly a leader, and you'll see that when you hear her speak. Previously, she was a senior managing director at Teneo Consulting Worldwide, and led leadership development and corporate responsibility, and has really worked with, a lot of change makers, essentially, or leaders who wanted to be change makers and were influenced by her. She's been recognized by Hockey News as 2020 top 100 most influential leaders in sports. Essence Magazine and many others have just recognized what a special person is, an impactful person she is. And she will be bringing her perspectives to us. We are also delighted to welcome back home to WCL Julie Andruff Jensen, a 2002 graduate who is the Senior Vice President, External Engagement and Communications at the Washington football team. And she is the Communications and Corporate Affairs leader, specializing in building the teams and strategies to help companies, organizations, and leaders affect change. She comes to us, or came to the team after being the Chief Corporate Affairs and Communications Officer at Citadel. So both Kim and Julie have some experience in the financial services industry, and we might hear a little bit more about that. And I'm delighted to introduce to those alums who did not get to have Professor Duru as a teacher when you were here. My colleague, Jeremy Duru, who is widely recognized for his excellence as an advocate and teacher. He specializes in sports law, as well as civil procedure and employment discrimination. and is really a leader on the issues that we're going to talk about. Part of, I think, Laura's goal for this series is to let our alumni community and the world know about some of the special things that are happening at WCL and the special people. And Jeremy Duru is definitely one of those. Um, he's a member of the United States Anti-Doping Agency's Anti-Doping Review Board, the NCAA's Committees on Competitive Safeguards and Medical Aspects of Sports, the National Sports Law Institute's Board of Advisors. Um, and he has represented the Fritz Pollard Alliance of Minority Coaches, and been very active in the field. And we're going to hear a lot more from him. And in fact, to kick us off, you know, we really are experiencing a lot of social awareness. And a real question I want to ask for all of this is this a passing moment, or is this is it real? And how do we know it's real? And Jeremy, you've been on working in this field and on these issues for such a long time. I'd like you to first give us your broad perspective on where we are and what's going on. And then I'm going to turn to Kim and Julie to really ground us in their reality and the change that they're trying to make and see. So Jeremy, take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Mike. I appreciate the kind introduction, and I appreciate being invited to participate in this panel, and really thrilled that Julie and Kim have agreed to join us here, and that all of you alums are here. I see many students who I taught there, the names and faces, so it's a real pleasure. Yeah, we are, something extraordinary is happening right now. And I think the big question, one of the questions that we're going to grapple with today, I think, is, what does that mean for post now? What does that mean for tomorrow and for next year? Now, I've been focusing on this intersection of race and sport. It's near and dear to my heart. I've been focusing on it since 2003, when I began working with coaches of color in the NFL who were concerned about racial discrimination in the league. Back in 2003, there was a real, when it came to athlete activism, there was a real sense of a vacuum. There wasn't much going on. The conversation then was, what happened to the Jim Browns and the Kareem Abdul-Jabbars and the Bill Russells, the athlete activists that we saw in the 60s. And there was a kind of a sadness in the community that was concerned about social progress and sport. And since then, there's kind of been a very slow initially boil that's kind of been growing and growing. So we saw what happened in spring of 2020 and last summer. But let's remember that athletes have been pushing on these grounds, particularly when it comes to criminal justice reform, since years before that. When Trayvon Martin was killed in South Florida, you may remember that the Miami Heat, LeBron James and others, donned hoodies, like the one Trayvon wore the night he was killed, and said basically, we all wear hoodies together. And they were basically told to shut up and dribble by most of the establishment, really in sport and outside of sport. And then when Eric Garner was killed in New York, athletes started wearing "I Can't Breathe" shirts, and that became a real rallying cry. And still, there was substantial resistance. Michael Brown, killed in Ferguson, Missouri. St. Louis Rams players came out onto the field with their hands up, as if to say, "Don't shoot," before a game. And they were criticized by their club, and they were criticized by the league. And a couple years after that, we, of course, are all familiar with Colin Kaepernick's decision to take a knee. And I think we're probably all familiar with the extent to which he really was pilloried for that. And he's not played it down in the league since 2016. And so there's been athlete activism, but it hasn't been embraced beyond the athletes. And something happened last spring where George Floyd was killed on the heels of Breonna Taylor being killed, on the heels of Ahmaud Arbery being killed, and it just became too much. It became too much, and there was a social explosion. We're all familiar with it. And a part of that explosion was athletes saying, we have to stand up. We can't take it anymore. And so you had athletes who refused to play in games, the NBA, the WNBA, Major League Soccer, Naomi Osaka she refused to participate in a tennis match. She became an extraordinary advocate. You had players calling on leagues to act. You all may have seen the video from some of the leading NFL players, Patrick Mahomes, Deshaun Watson, Michael Thomas, and others, who basically said, we need the league to come out and say Black Lives Matter. And within a couple of days, Roger Goodell released a video where he said, Black Lives Matter. And he said, we were wrong when we didn't acknowledge what Colin Kaepernick was protesting about. And so we had this great shift last summer where what began as athlete activism with a slow boil into an explosion turned into a sports industry wide moment. And now that it's become that, it's kind of on the leagues and the clubs to carry us forward. And that's one, and to help us determine if this is just a moment or if indeed it will be a movement. And so I'm just so thrilled. I'll pass the mic back to you, Mike, and you can pass it to my fellow panelists. But I'm just so thrilled that we have with us a representative of a league and a representative of a club, and then representatives of two different sports to kind of give us some context as to what they feel their clubs and their leagues can do to really move us as a society to a better place.
Terrific. And so maybe as we sort of get from the most general to the most specific, maybe I'll turn to you, Kim, for a minute to sort of your responsibilities are across a league. So there are independent franchises that have decision-making, some amount of decision-making authority that's local. But tell us a little bit more about your role, why you were brought in, and what you're trying to accomplish in that role.
Sure. Thank you, Michael. And Jeremy, thank you for the context set. I think it was powerful and important to this conversation. I joined the NHL about 3 years ago in a newly created position by the commissioner as the first senior executive vice president of corporate responsibility, social impact, growth, and legislative affairs. And my mandate, while a lot in that title, is really simply about how do we think about changing demographics in this country, across North America and the world, and how do we position the NHL to respond to those changing demographics as a growth lever for the future of our sport. And it's a very interesting position to be in, because when I look back at my career in financial services, some almost 30 years ago, I did similar work. In that part of my career, banks were coming to grips with a world that both culturally and demographically was changing at a pace that was faster than the internal practices and the traditions, particularly in a very disruptive period of mergers and acquisitions in the 90s. And so at that time, navigating issues of diversity and equity and inclusion within an entrenched corporate culture was ripe, as it is today in the NHL, with challenges. But I think most importantly, the opportunities are enormous. And I think that's where we've been focused. I often say that all of the racial and health pandemics that we've been through of the last year for the NHL was really more of an acceleration point than anything, because it allowed us to really accelerate and amplify work that we had been trying to undertake. And I think the greatest sign of that, to your point about is this a moment or a movement, is when we had the killing. And as you said, Jeremy, we've seen many killings. But when the killing happened, we had 128 of our white players step up and use their social platforms in a way that we've never seen, frankly, in the history of the NHL. Now, remember, the NHL is a league where 93% of our players are white. And so the issues of both athlete advocacy and allyship are critical for us to have white players engaged in that process. We won't survive or be successful in this kind of advocacy if we don't have white players. What's significant about 128 players, white players stepping up, was that they hadn't used their social platforms that way for anything. And so at that moment, 128 players from all over the world, because 32% of our players are from outside of the United States and Canada, those players said, this is not human. We are now dealing with an issue of humanity. And that began a real firestorm in our culture around all things that have to do with diversity and inclusion in a very earnest way. We got extremely focused on creating models and structures and infrastructure within the league that will allow us to ensure that this is not a moment, but it is a movement, which we can talk about in a moment. But I think that that gives me hope and a sign that we're on a different trajectory than we've seen in the past.
Thanks so much for that great introduction. And then Julie, hardly last, but or hardly least. So, you know, you're here in DC. You come to the Washington football team, a team that has had some trouble, you know. When we think about issues around race, we're focused on Black Lives Matter and the particular issues that Jeremy pointed us to, but then the Washington football team has had an issue with the name and the long pressure campaign. And was it merely a coincidence, or is there a connection? And as you decided to take on this role, given the history of the team and some of the other issues involving the cheerleaders and other kinds of personnel issues, what you're kind of stepping in, you know, what made you decide to take this on, and is it real, or is this just window dressing?
Thank you, Mike. I really appreciate that. There's so many questions in there. I could go on for about an hour, but I'll try to unpack a few of them first. But first, just nice to see everybody. Being a former alum, or being an alum, former law student at WCL, I have very fond memories of my time sitting at Starbucks across from the old law school, not the new law school, and sitting in your shoes. And I had some really amazing years there, and some tremendous professors. Didn't have the fortunate chance to take a class with Jeremy, but maybe I can audit one. Maybe you guys will take his class now. You know, it was such a fascinating time when this job came up for me. So my role is head of external engagement and communications. And very similar to Kim, this role didn't exist for the Washington football team. We created it when Jason Wright came in as the president of the team. He approached me about this job and said, I want to do something different here. We're in a real transition period. We're going to transform a lot of what this team has been, but try to hold on to our rich history of the past and some incredible things that have happened in the past. And how do we navigate that? And to me, that sounded like a dream job. To some people, they think I'm crazy. But I think, you know, what I saw was a lot of potential and possibility for the storytelling of a franchise that has had a couple challenging years more recently, but that wanted to turn things around and do things differently. And so what I did, just like you all would do for a class, or maybe even as you're looking for a professor you want to take a class with, is do your homework, right? And figure out, you know, is this true? Are they wanting to look at things in a different way? You know, really get smart about what happened and where it was going. And when I looked into Jason's background, he's such a compelling figure in what he wants to do. And looking at Coach Rivera and knowing what he wants to do, you know, those two leaders to me were so inspiring. I knew right away this was what I wanted to do next with my career. I also happen to be a bit of a sports junkie and a huge football fan. I grew up in Buffalo, New York. In Buffalo, football is a religion right next to all the other religions on Sunday. And so, you know, this was something that I was really passionate about. I also have two sons who happen to both play flag football and follow ESPN all day long. So I get my breaking news mostly from the two of them, which is very helpful for my job some days. So, you know, it just was a great opportunity. But I think one of the other pieces, and this is what goes into the topic of conversation today, I knew we had an opportunity to do something at a time when athletes' voices and the platform were only growing. And so to be able to be in this moment of change in history and see the momentum that was behind the change that was happening, and knowing that the athletes have a platform that is so much larger than what most people have. And the difference is they were coming together in a bigger way. So before it was individual players or smaller groups of players. Here, Kim, to your point, you seeing broader groups of athletes, entire teams coming out and sitting and kneeling on the sidelines together, or linking arms together, or saying they weren't going to play a game together or miss a practice. And that to me showed there was real lasting effect to this, and there was much more of a movement happening than we had seen before. And so to be able to work with athletes and a franchise that has the ability to really help impact change in a meaningful way, to me was an incredibly exciting opportunity. And to know that social justice issues are not going away anytime soon, but that we could have a voice in those was just too good of an opportunity. And as a woman, I also know that there are not a lot of women in these seats. And how great is it that I get to be here with Kim today for both hockey and football. We don't look like the normal executives that have been in these jobs in the past. And that also felt a bit like a responsibility to me to be able to go in at a very senior level as a woman and be in that conversation where we're making some really difficult decisions and going through transformation, and to try to be a role model for other women who want to go into sports and show a pathway of the fact that you can be in these jobs. I didn't come up through sports. I've had a lot of different experiences in financial services and consulting and politics and law. And so this one feels like it kind of pulls it all together in one big puzzle piece.
All right, really interesting. So one thing, let's do another round. And on this one, I want to ask a little bit about, as you both touched on the role the players are playing, right? That's the, one of the questions I have, and trying to tie this to the day-to-day work that some of the folks in the audience do, is how much of this is specific to professional sports and how much of this is organizational behavior change, where there are lessons we can learn. We know that the corporate world talks the talk of, everybody's on a team, and we get the ball across the line, and we use sports metaphors in business all the time. So it certainly has an influence in the way people think of themselves in organizational settings. But not all employees have the kind of platform and power that you guys are describing. For a while they weren't using it, but they have it. And I also study the technology industry, and in Silicon Valley, the engineers have a certain amount of power because they're a scarce resource. But there are lots of other industries where we're starting to see glimmers of collective action on some of these issues, and maybe not. And I'm wondering, is this relegated to sport, or is sport maybe going to help us, take the lead, or at least set an example that we might see in other organizational settings? And if I can go back to Jeremy, because I know part of your interest in studying the relationship between race and sport is as a window into the broader issues in society. And so from where you sit, is this a sports exceptionalism conversation, or is this an organizational behavior change conversation that others can learn from?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I don't think it's a sports exceptionalism conversation at all. I feel privileged to work in sport. From the conversation we had the other day, Julie and Kim, it's clear they also feel privileged to work in sport. One of the reasons I feel privileged to work in sport is because of the platform that it does have. When I began working with the coaches of color in the NFL, it occurred to me that, name whatever major corporation you want to name, IBM. IBM gets a new CEO. That's a big deal. The Dallas Cowboys get a new head coach. That's a bigger deal. That's more people are following what's happening with a professional sports franchise than what's happening with the Fortune 50 company. And so that creates a responsibility for sport. And I truly believe that if we can tackle societal challenges in sport, it can provide a roadmap, a blueprint for it to happen outside of sport. And I think you made a very interesting point, Mike, which is that athletes have a profile that gives them power that most employees don't have. And so most employees likely wouldn't be able to have made the shift in the industry, caused the shift in the industry that athletes have caused in their industries. But what these athletes have done in causing a shift in the industry is impact the leagues and the clubs and prompt them to be active. And these leagues and clubs now can be emulated by other organizations that don't need to be pushed by their own employees. If their employees can push and have the power to push and the fortitude to push, that's great. But these other organizations and these other industries now have a roadmap that sport has provided, which is one of the reasons I think it's so important for the leagues and the clubs to keep pushing and keep chopping and keep working on these issues such that other organizations and other industries can follow suit.
Great, thank you. And then Kim, when we were prepping for this, you told us a little bit about what you're dealing with, and one of the things that was really interesting, and we might be able to show a graphic to sort of explain this, is that it's a new role. So there's some recognition at the top of the organization that change needs to happen. But maybe dig in a little bit. What kind of change, and how do you make it lasting change? What are your sort of operating principles for coming into an organization that's waking up to this and wants to do the right thing, but doesn't really have a great history or track record of it? How are you going to help them get to where they want to go and where you want to see them go?
Sure. So let me start by just affirming what Jeremy said about the impact that sport can have on culture, how sport shapes culture and the way culture shapes sport. And the fact is that on one end of the continuum, you have the players as advocates, and they do push sports organizations, both at the league and the club levels, to do more. But you also have on the other end of that, the fandom change that is occurring, the journey of the fan, particularly the millennial and the Gen Zer fan, which I call the fan in waiting. And as owners and leagues look at the growth of the business, and everybody understands growth of the business, everybody wants the business to grow. I think people are clear as they look at demographics that we can no longer think about any of these sports through the traditional lens. We have to look at what the both attitudinal and buying behaviors are of these new generations, and they are demanding that their associations be with those organizations and institutions that value social justice, that are engaged in it in an authentic and non-performative way. So one of the first things I did when I joined the league was do a demographic study in partnership with the Brookings Institute, an old friend of mine who was a senior demographer there, William Fry. And we co-authored a piece that was about demographic shifts in North America and the implications that those shifts would have on the future of hockey. And then we took that show on the road. We took that data and we went around to, literally in a year, I went to 28 of our 31 clubs and met with the presidents and the C-suite of those clubs. And I didn't go out there emotionally saying, you got to get more women and people of color involved. I said, your business will either live or die based on your ability to think about the future customer. And that just changed the way in which we began to think about and engage around this topic. Models, I think, are important. Systems are important. Process is important. And that's something that came from my training in financial services. And I don't know if we have the slide, I can quickly show it, but
yeah,
you know, this is the way we are tackling this problem as a systems-wide issue. We have identified 7 areas that we identify as best practices in diversity, equity, and inclusion. leadership education, employment. Leadership is what voices are you listening to at every level that are allowing you to bring innovation and creativity to your thinking around this topic. Education is how deep are you going within your organization in anti-racist training? We're not talking about compliance training. We're talking about learning and education. Employment is what are you doing in understanding your current demographics and what kind of benchmarks are you setting over the next 3 to 5 years to bring more women and BIPOC into your organization. Marketing is how culturally available and relevant are you making your fan experience so that we are engaging new audiences, and then we go on from there. This is a framework that is being adopted by all 32 of our clubs. It allows them to use this as a way to measure and evaluate themselves over time, but also it creates sort of friendly competition among the clubs, which Julie knows is an important part of the sports environment. And we are measuring this year over year. So we did a benchmark survey around those 7 dimensions in December. And so we know where every club stands, both quantitatively and qualitatively across those 7 dimensions. We'll look at that again a year from December and to see what progress has been made. And then we're setting metrics against that model. So we're being intentional about this work. It's not just let's all try to do it, but who's doing it, who has notable practices that we can look at, and how are we moving forward as a league so that all boats float.
Very impressive, sort of Moneyball for DE&I, which is, you know, given the role of statistics in the industry, right? It's great that you're so data-driven and evidence-based. I love it. So yes, so Julie, then let's you know, within the club atmosphere, and as you think about, you know, driving change, and you said, so new leadership gave you some confidence that there's sort of the will, but even with the political will, there's the how and the what and the when, and part of your job is to figure that out. How are you going about that? And you talked about sort of harnessing the player energy. How much of it is coming from you, and how much of it is sort of managing the flow of energy around this?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. You know, we're trying to lead by example from the leadership team perspective, both on the business and the football side. So, you know, the way Coach approaches this, the way Jason approaches it, it's about creating a diverse environment at all levels. And that's diversity of thought, you know, geography, backgrounds, the way we look, everything, right? It's being driven from the top. But we're also listening to our employees and what they're looking for. And, you know, one of the things that bubbled up very early on, we created a group called Ben, and it stems from the leagues. The NFL started this maybe about a year ago now. And it's our Black Engagement Network. And they said, you know, we want to create this. It's the first one that a club started aside from the league-wide effort that was made. And it's really taken off for us because they've now self-organized and they come up with initiatives to support that align with our values as a team. So we set out the values of what we care about. So a great example, they decided to launch something called Shop Black the day after Thanksgiving for that Saturday on Small Business Saturday. And they created this whole initiative. They recruited the companies to come in, and all we did was use our platform to promote those businesses. Knowing that we're in a COVID environment that's so challenging, we thought, what can we do to help? Well, back to Jeremy's point, we have this platform, let's use it for good. So we created it. We ended up getting a really nice story that Friday evening leading into it, interviewing some of the small business owners who were thrilled to get some free publicity and try to help promote their business. So some of it's coming up from the actual staff through our team. And some of it's from the leadership level where we need to provide that structure. And then the other piece, you know, the players are intimately involved. And one of the things that came about very early after I started is that they wanted to be engaged in conversations around police reform and what some of our jurisdictional leadership was doing in Maryland, Virginia, and DC. So we've been participating in conversations with elected officials in all 3 of those areas, which we have the unique DMV dynamic of having the 2 states in the district and lots of electeds to be able to talk with. all around police reform and the legislation that they're looking at, and how can we be active participants in that? How can the players lend their voices to things that they care deeply about? Chase Young joined a call last week with Doug Williams, and I thought that was a great example of showing kind of where we've been as a team, with the first Black quarterback to win a Super Bowl with Doug Williams with our team, to Chase Young being, the new, hopefully, gets NFL honors on Saturday night as a defensive player of the year. But he, to have these two come together, and with Chase's connection to the local community, that was just a beautiful example of the fact that they are doing this genuinely on their own. This isn't something we asked them to do. We just help organize it and put the meeting together and help facilitate the conversation. So I think it's important because it has to be authentic. If you're forcing these conversations, they won't last. And to your point earlier, when you kind of kicked off the call, is it real? Why does it feel different this time around? I think it's for all of these kinds of factors, that there's more of a movement around it. There's more support behind it. And then, the other part is, I say, follow the money, right? Where's the money going? And if the money is flowing into areas that are mattering to these conversations, it will be more lasting. So, a great example is the NFL incentivizing clubs to hire diverse looking candidates. And those candidates, if they come in and get hired, you're now getting draft picks in the 3rd round, which is a huge bonus to the clubs. The 3rd round draft pick is a really big incentive. So they're trying to come up with good programmatic things that help incentivize for the right reasons. And then it's up to the clubs to figure it out. So, I'm thrilled. We just hired our new general manager, Martin Mayhew, for all the reasons that he's just an outstanding human being. And we're really glad to welcome him back to Washington. But another example of just how we're trying to lead from the top and build one of the most diverse leadership teams that's out there in sports right now.
Great, thank you. And yeah, you got a nice piece in the Post today.
Finally.
So one, an audience, I really appreciate you guys sticking with us. You're going to get your turn in a minute. There's one last question I want to ask our panelists before we open it up, and that is what we're hearing is sort of the wind at the back story, that organizationally the wind is at the back, there's forward movement, but we all know that social change is hard, and that there are going to be sources of resistance. And is it 2 steps forward, 1 step back? What are the biggest risks in professional sports? Is it fans saying, cut it with the political correctness, or what are the biggest risks in your that might limit this to a moment as opposed to being a movement? And Julie, since you're on the screen, why don't we'll reverse the order, and Jeremy will give us his broader perspective. But in your current role, what are you most worried about, and how are you going to navigate around that?
Yeah, it's really interesting question. I mean, I think what I worry about is things happening that continue to fan the flames in a negative way, right? So if we use the inaugural, the situation happened before inauguration, right? While it gives us a good illustration of the stark problem that we're facing, it's also just painful to keep going through these moments over and over, right? So while we can use them as a catalyst and really mobilize around them, it also, it brought our team together, frankly. I mean, we communicated around that with each other. We tried to figure out ways to support each other through that, because what I was realizing throughout the day was people were having really strong reactions to it, all of us. And especially because we're in the DMV, so it feels much more personal to us what was happening, because this is our home. But we had to figure out a way to adjust our way of doing business for the next couple of days because of what was happening at that moment, that we couldn't ignore it. So you're now realizing that, things are getting, it's inevitable, things are going to happen and they're going to derail where you are, but you have to kind of adjust quickly to figure out how to take that opportunity and make something good out of it. And we tried to be a leader in that time. And Coach Rivera came out the next morning on, I think it was ESPN, in an interview, and said some very supportive things that I thought were really important for him to talk about at that time. So that to me is the hardest thing, because it's unpredictable and you don't know when something's going to happen and how it's going to affect the team. And you just have to be ready to adjust and be really honest and transparent about it, and make sure that you've got that open line of communication internally and with the stakeholders that you care about.
Great, thank you. Kim, how about you, especially given the demographics that you cited about who's in power and who the fan base is and who the players are? Is this a passing moment?
Well, the thing I worry about is exhaustion and weariness by people, frankly. I think that, you know, we are experiencing that, and this moment that we're in, while on one hand is terribly difficult and painful, there's a part of it where our attention are focused in a different way. And so, you know, even if you think about a conversation like the one we're having now, if it wasn't COVID time, you know, maybe we wouldn't be having this conversation, right? Because, you know, we would be trying to do it in person and maybe we wouldn't be available. So I think there are lots more conversations happening about these topics because of this moment of COVID. And I worry when we get back to whatever the new normal is, that we're going to get weary and we're going to lose focus. And that's why we really have to push hard during this period to put the systems and the processes and build the allyship, particularly at the most senior levels in our organization, so that they are committed and, you know, and have the staying power.
Great, thank you. And Jeremy, and audience, if you want to start sharing your thoughts and questions in the chat, please feel free. And after Jeremy's done talking, I'll be turning to you. If you want to participate in the conversation, you can raise your hand, depending on which version of Zoom you have. The most recent one, you click on reactions and there's a raise hand function. Otherwise, the older version, you click on participants. But if you can this would be the item inviting you to queue up in front of the mic in the room, as Jeremy gives us words of wisdom to close out this part of the program. So Jeremy, what are the risks, and you know, how worried are you that this is just a moment because of those?
I echo what Julie and Kim said. There is some concern. I guess for me, what I'm worried about is this is an extraordinary moment, and you know, it's also a moment of interest convergence in some ways. You know, I'll use the Roger Goodell video where he came out and said Black Lives Matter in response to what his players asked him to say. And by the way, I actually think Roger Goodell gets a bad rap. I think he's a good person. I think he's deeply committed to these issues. What concerns me is when the interests aren't as, you know, so there's the right thing to do, and there's a thing that you have to do for business purposes. And this summer, those two things converged, and what Roger Goodell did in that video satisfied both. But when we get to a point where perhaps the best thing to do for business isn't necessarily the right thing, what happens? And my hope is that the sports industry leading, right, taking its responsibility to society seriously, will do the right thing.
Okay, and we've got our first question. That's great, but where's Colin Kay and the dearth of Black coaches in the NFL? Jeremy, I think that's to you.
Sure. That's a great question. So Colin Kay is not playing right now. And I don't know if everybody watches NFL football, but throughout the season, there was some very poor quarterbacking. There were a lot of injuries and some really, really poor quarterbacking. And I've talked to scouts, you know, throughout the league. There is no question that Colin Kaepernick, even now, is a top 64, top 70 quarterback in the league. Now, I don't even know if he'd want to play now, actually. But there's no question that he has the talent to play, and he's essentially been frozen out for several years. And it's wrong. And I think that the NFL Power Trust greatly regrets the way that they handled it. And when Colin Kaepernick had that kind of scuttled tryout in Atlanta that some of you may remember, I think that was when the bridge broke between the sides. And I just don't think that, there's a personal matter. I just don't know that there's reconciling. It's very, very unfortunate. And with respect to the coaches, yeah, I mean, I focus on that piece very, very closely. I think the league has worked hard on that this past offseason. Julie mentioned one of the initiatives that the league's brought into play with respect to the draft picks. They've also strengthened the Rooney Rule. They've done a number of things. And this hiring cycle on the general manager side, it went reasonably well. I want to point out that Martin Mayhew, just so we understand, to your point, Dean, some of the double standard that exists in professional sport. Martin Mayhew is the first Black general manager in the history of the league to have been fired and then got another job. Whereas it's happened for white general managers time and again. And again, with head coaches, it's also much more rare for people of color. So Mayhew was a great hire for the Washington football team. But overall, it was a bad hiring cycle with respect to head coaches. And every club instituted the Rooney Rule. The initiatives that Julie mentioned are in play. At the end of the day, I think that the responsibility lies not at the feet of the league, but at the feet of the individual club owners. And the individual club owners have to start asking the question, who's best for the team? Not the question, who do I want to hire? Those are different questions, and they're generally different answers. And to that point, I'll direct everybody. Coach Tony Dungy wrote an open letter to NFL owners that was published today. It's an extraordinary letter. I recommend it. If you haven't read it, that you read it.
I haven't seen it yet. He's amazing. So I'm looking forward to reading that. Okay, audience, it's your turn. Thank you for the question, Dean. You broke the ice. That it's, in law school, you got the first cold call on day one. Nicely done. And you don't have to have a question, just a thought or reaction to what you heard. Anything that Kim shared, is that useful to you as you think about your organizations or your clients' organizations? And
Mike, I'm going to kind of play a dual role. I'm part of you, but I'm going to pretend I'm a panelist, right? Or not a non-panelist right now. So one of the things that we discussed before was, what is the risk to progress? And I was really paying attention to what you said, Kim, about using this opportunity right now to drill down and put in place the infrastructure that's really required. Because my implication, or what I'm getting from that, is that's the best way to ensure that when this time period of COVID and the ability to have these conversations is over, that's the only way to assure that the progress that has been made thus far continues. And it drills down. So I guess here's my question. So it goes back to best practices. And these are things, and Julia addressed this too. You follow the money, you see where corporations are investing the dollars to make structural change possible. What are the best practices corporate wide? Sport, again, is a way to amplify these things and to lead other corporations by example. Kim, you got into some of that with drilling down and using demographics and data driven. But if you just had to give people a main takeaway of what are the best practices to make lasting change in corporate infrastructure so that these things do continue, and it is good for business, it is growth, what are they? And it doesn't have to be like a Bible, just like your top three. What are the top three things you need to nail down as a corporation to make sure that you have continued success after this brief blip is over?
Yeah. So those 7 dimensions that I highlighted, I do believe those are best practices across industry. I don't consider those to be best practices in sport. In fact, they were derived from a lot of work that I did as a consultant, but also models that have been used and tried by Korn Ferry and Deloitte and McKinsey. So there's nothing proprietary about the topics. I think the way we're using them and the way we're thinking about it within the context of the NHL will have some proprietary elements to it because it will be unique for our league. I actually organized our framework by what I consider to be sort of the importance in terms of how you begin to pull and push the levers. And I say it that way because we often want a sort of a sequential, roadmap of how these things are done. What comes first, what comes second. And I think that's where we've probably made a lot of mistakes in this field, regardless of industry. These are levers that have to be pulled simultaneously. And sometimes they have to be, the pistons have to be shifted based on the nature of the particular organization. Each club is different. The demographics within each market are going to be different, but the theory of change should be the same. And so what I've said to our clubs is, number one, you have got to have buy-in from the top. And that's why leadership is always at the top for me of any model. It's great to have a grassroots and a groundswell from the bottom, and that's important. But that without support from the top, at some point you lose momentum and you don't have the power dynamic necessary and the financial support necessary to move forward. So I think leadership is critical. Second, in the case of our organization, and I think most organizations, education is paramount. So many people don't understand what you're talking about. People's definitions are different. And so there needs to be a level set understanding of when we talk about anti-racism, what are we talking about? When we talk about DEI, what does that mean? There also needs to be an authentic conversation and some straight talk about some of the issues that exist within your culture that are standing in the way of progress. That's real hard conversation. And that's where most of this has stalled historically in organizations. And those two are critical, in my opinion, before you can start doing the work. It's like they say, relationships before task. You need to build the relationship of the organization before you can start moving on the task. And the rest of it really begins to be focused on more tasks.
Great, thank you. So two things. One, Tori, thanks for leading in the way. I put in the chat, if for the alumni, if you wouldn't mind, there's a way to rename yourself so we can see your graduation year. You click on participants, you find your name, you click on more, and you have a chance to rename yourself, just to give us a sense of which class years we have in the room. The last time we did this, it was amazing. We have, from the most recent to back in the 70s, it was wonderful. Jeremy, there was another question in the chat about, do you think Deuce Staley got passed over even though the Philadelphia Press didn't read it that way?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, Deuce has been, he was with the Eagles for a long time. Now he's with the Lions, just, made the transition. But I think he's been, underappreciated throughout his tenure. I think the Eagles head coach hire this offseason took a lot of people by surprise. The person who was hired was a relatively unknown candidate, and they passed over a lot of candidates who appeared to be pretty strong candidates. And I think Deuce had been for some time. Deuce kind of hoped there'd be more of an opportunity there. But we'll see what happens with him on Detroit. The thing that's unfortunate, and this plays back into race and perspective, it is very rare that a running backs coach becomes a head coach. It is a very difficult path. Anthony Lynn, who's a coach for the Chargers, who was just recently terminated, he's a running backs coach, and he got the job. Dan Reeves, if folks remember him, of the Broncos years back. And I think maybe one or two others in the history of the NFL who are running backs coaches who progressed. I think one reason for that is that running backs coaches are almost entirely African American, and it's kind of like a positional stacking with coaches. The coaching pipelines tend to be quarterback coach and offensive line coach, who then move up to coordinator, offensive coordinator, who move up to head coach, and quarterback coach and offensive line coach. Those coaches are often white, disproportionately white. And so there's a tracking that went on that I think disadvantaged Deuce, but I also think, I mean, he served the club well. It would have been nice to have seen him get an opportunity at the top of the coaching hierarchy, but hopefully there'll be pastures that he deems to be greener out there with Detroit.
Great. So 2 really great questions in the chat. Witana, I hope I said your name right, asks if someone can speak to NASCAR's decision to prohibit the use of the Confederate flag. And is that something we should think of as just being done in the moment, or and how the fans reacted to that? Or, you know, can NASCAR be part of the movement, or is that sort of an island? I mean, I realize being in one sport and talking about someone else's sport might be a little sensitive, but it's a great question and love anybody's willingness to react.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in NASCAR, so I can't speak on behalf of them, but I can tell you as a fan, when that happened, my eyes kind of opened a little bit wider at that moment. That was a surprise to me when that step was taken. And I took that again in kind of the context of what we're talking about, which is this is different. That fan base is not a diverse fan base at this point, but I think they know that it's probably going to become a much more diverse fan base, to your point, Kim. And, you know, they need to think about the evolution of the sport. And I think that's across all sports at this point. You know, it's not just NASCAR. There are other sports in that situation. You know, football just happens to be at the flip side of that, where 70% of the athletes are Black. So it's different. But at the same point, we were still having similar problems. So I really commended NASCAR for taking that step and really showing that they meant what they said, and they stuck by it. They didn't shrink back from it. They didn't change it. I thought that was a really good step.
Yeah, I agree. These, you know, in many ways, NASCAR, you know, and the NHL has a similar fan base, frankly. And I think it's really important for these leagues to make strong statements like that, because you're constantly being watched. And no matter what you do, it's those kinds of symbols, I think, that have represented these sports for so long that people are looking to see taken down. So it's a journey. It's not an event, right? And it's a hard, long journey, and you've got to make progress along the way. I think that was a major move for NASCAR.
Yeah,
I agree 100. I echo 100%. I'll leave it right there.
Okay. Well, and then Tori asks, within the conversation about race and sport, is the intersectionality of female athletes, differently abled athletes, et cetera, and given the athlete activism, do you expect to see movement, you know, along these lines, better, basically a more inclusive, let's focus on the I of DEI. Do we expect to see more pressure on inclusivity across intersectional dimensions and not just on race? Jump ball.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, this kind of goes to the point that I was saying about Kim and I sitting here right now, and looking at diversifying at all levels of the organization. You know, we know, everyone knows the statistics, right? I'm sure your organizations, wherever you all work, are the same in this regard, that if you get diversity in leadership and in a room, you get different outcomes. And so we're aiming for that. But I think, you know, what's really interesting about the gender and equity issues, which we could have a whole separate conversation about as a part 2, we also have been thinking about this and how can we use our platform at the Washington football team to work with female athletes to help raise their platform and get more eyeballs with them. And so, you know, one thing you may, if you follow us on Twitter or Instagram, we just recently had Washington Spirit come in this week, and they started using our practice bubble out in Ashburn, and they needed a place to practice. We had already planned this before the snow arrived, but it was even better when the snow arrived. And they said, you know, look, we'd love to be able to use your facility. And we said, absolutely, come in and use it. And then we said, well, what else can we be doing together? So now we're actually starting to collaborate on a lot more, not just around content, but we really want to make sure that we're trying to tap into our fan base to help the Washington Spirit and the women's soccer team. And they in turn will also help us bring some women into the NFL fan base here in DC, which we know there are a lot of female fans, and that demographic's growing. So there's a good business case for it. It's the right thing to do. And frankly, it's just going to be a lot of fun to work with them. So I think we're going to hit a home run on this one.
Yeah, this is, I get on a soapbox when it comes to inclusion, because this is where I believe all of us are going to be measured as to whether this stuff that we're doing is truly substantive or performative, and it is at the intersections. And for us, one of the first things that we did over a year ago is put a number of councils and committees in place, bringing almost 70 voices from outside of the league and the clubs into the dialogue. And our player inclusion committee includes an equal number of men, current, former players, and women that are involved in women's hockey. And we made it clear from the beginning that if we don't come out of this process with a definitive point of view about the future of women's hockey, then it won't be real. And in the meantime, we ought to be helping to expose these women who in many ways know more about hockey than some of the men to front office opportunities. So we have been on a journey for the past 7 or 8 months of exposing these athletes, these elite female athletes, to clubs so that they can be hired. So Blake Bolden, who's a Black female hockey player, was hired as the first female scout by the LA Kings. And Sarona Tinker, who was captain of the Yale team, is in conversation. Seattle has hired a number of women. Chicago has hired a number of women. These were resources that they hadn't even focused on as front office, and not just in general manager kind of roles, but hockey operations in the areas where they have substantive expertise and competency. So it cuts all ways. And I think this is really, really an important area for us to stay focused on.
Yeah, and Jeremy, before you jump in, why don't we just tag in with Hannah's next question, which it really builds on exactly where Kim was about the role of the WNBA and the Women's National Soccer League, you're both women working in men's professional sports organizations, but Jeremy, what do you think about the women's professional sports and their role in this movement?
Sure. Yeah, I saw that great question. I was gonna go there. But before I go there, Kim said something that just struck me that I wanted just to echo. She said, we're going to be measured. And I've thought about that a lot lately, outside of sport now, just for all of us on this call as human beings. My kids and my kids' kids are going to read about 2020 and 2021 and 2022. And, and our descendants are going to ask us, well, what did you do then? Or they'll wonder, what did my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother, so I just think all of us need to recognize that history will judge us with what we do during this time. And so I think we all have an obligation to, to do the right thing. To be brave.
Yes.
I love Tori's question and Watana's question. I think, and I'm glad Watana pointed out, when I talked about the slow boil, the WNBA players got out with courage really before anybody else in professional in this country. And it was extraordinary for, among other reasons, they make the least money and likely have the least financial security, but they were willing to stand out and be the most vocal. I don't, there may be some political scientists who want to challenge me on this, we can talk about it, but I think there's an argument that without the WNBA's advocacy, the Georgia senatorial elections go in the other direction. It's possible the WNBA shifted the US Senate. And it's an extraordinary thought. So I think that WNBA players have been deeply underappreciated with what they've provided to this movement. Quite frankly, just as we're talking about the racial justice movement, just as Black women have been underappreciated over the course of the last century. And so I think we need to, one, further appreciate what, and I see the women's national soccer teams also mentioned, what these athletes are doing from an activist perspective, and give them the respect they deserve as both activists and athletes. Our nation's sporting attentions are terribly skewed toward men, and that's got to change.
And it is changing. Almost 40% of the NHL's fan base are women. And nobody was talking about that until Heidi Browning, our CMO, and myself sat around the executive table, right? You know, Heidi was hired a year before me from Silicon Valley outside of sport. A year later, I came from financial services. Our voices around that table are changing the conversation and amplifying things that hadn't been amplified before. When you start talking about a fan base of 40% being women, number one, and that the fastest growing demographic for youth hockey are girls, you better wake up and start thinking about your future. And I think that when we started talking about those statistics, clubs started listening and things started changing. So you're absolutely right, Jeremy. And by the way, yes, the WNBA, but also my Spellman sister, Stacey Adams, responsible for the Georgia change.
That's great. Hey, so I don't see any questions in the chat, and I actually would love to have the opportunity to cold call on a couple of people. But Denise, can I ask you, can we go ahead and stop the recording? Or I guess I could. So before we do, for anyone who's watching this recorded, thank you for joining us.